hot. All right, good morning, everybody. I think all of us should just kind of come over here closer and kind of huddle in and just try to keep warm here. Hope everybody had a good morning. Appreciate all of our visitors here this morning. This morning we're going to be talking about made in His image, and we're going to talk about reflecting the love of God. And just by way of review, we've talked about this idea of image, being an image bearer of God. And we looked to the first verse of the first chapter of the Bible, and it talks about how God made us in His image. And another way that we could possibly describe that is, He said, let us make man to be like us and to represent us. God formed us and He breathed life into us. So what does that say about the term image? What do we mean by when we say image? Representation. Yeah, it's a representation or a reflection of something possibly greater. For example, the swoosh. When you see the swoosh, what do you automatically think of? Nike. When you see the small bite out of the apple, what do you think of? Apple. So it represents something far greater. And we are icons. That's where the word comes from for image. We are little icons of God reflecting His image to the world. And so if I'm made in the image of God and I'm called to bear His image and conform myself to His Son, who is the perfect image bearer of Him, we started at holiness. So what do we mean by holiness? It's the idea of being made for the exclusive use for God. It's that we belong to God. And we talked about how pots can be holy, and fire can be holy, and ground can be holy. Why are those things holy? Yeah, they're set aside to God. They belong to God. So we find our sense of belonging. We find our identity in the holiness of God. And seeing God more clearly allows ourselves to see ourselves more clearly, correct? We talked about how Isaiah was in the presence of God, and he heard that seraph song, "Holy, holy, holy." And he said, "Woe is me, for I am undone." He saw himself as a sinner. And the only way that he could remedy that is through the atonement of God. The holy fire, the holy coal touching his mouth and cleansing him from his iniquity. So as we continue to see God more clearly, we come to the love of God. I want to talk about this morning, how we can accurately reflect His love and how this can have a profound effect on us as well as those that surround us. Here's kind of our blueprint. We're going to talk about the meaning of God's love, the search for love, and agape love in action. Why do you think the idea that God is love... I'm about to trip on this thing, so I need to move it out of there. Why do you think the idea that God is love is so popular with the world? Ooh, I like that answer. He said the world's idea of God is subjective. Okay, I like that. There's a lot in that. There's a lot in that statement. Yeah, Jamie. Oh, okay. What else? Why do you think that this idea that God is love is so popular with the world?
If God is love, we can do whatever we want, and then He'll just forgive us, and we'll still be okay.
We kind of like talking about love, right? Makes us feel pretty good. We didn't really like talking about holiness because it brought our sin kind of right there in our face. When we talk about God's love, or just talking about love, it makes us feel pretty good, right? Yes, sir.
It's also the world's view of love is that it should all be unconditional.
Okay, the world's view of love should always be unconditional. Okay, we can talk about that for sure. What does the world typically see as their definition of love? How would they define love? Yeah. I'm sorry. Acceptance? Okay. Yeah, that's a big part of the idea of the world when they describe love. What else?
Flowery feeling.
A flowery feeling. Yes, that's good. An emotion. I think that's exactly right. The world likes to describe this idea of an emotion. Yeah. Oh. Oh, okay, okay. And that definitely permeates our society. That definitely permeates our society. What makes it difficult to understand love correctly?
Pop culture.
Pop culture? Yeah, kind of cultural, I guess, variances is maybe a way to describe it. Yeah, we're going to talk about that in just a second. I think one of the really challenges that we have is how we use the term love. Let me give you an example. We use it kind of generally and indiscriminately is what I wrote down here. I love Joanna. I love my kids. I love street tacos. Is there do you see the difference? I use the same term, but do I really like or love tacos more than my family or Joanna? I sure hope not. We went to Savannah in October, and we ate street tacos, I think 4 or 5 times while we were there. Just a couple days. We just love them. So good. Raise your hand if you've been to Savannah. Hughes has been to Savannah. They used to live there. Great town. Awesome town. It's not the mecca of street tacos, but we just love them so much. So it's our English language that kind of makes this difficult for us to really put our fingerprint on the idea of defining love. And then, like Jamie said, there's cultural challenges. Our culture loves love. We like to worship romance. We have a whole genre of movies called what? Rom-com. Romantic comedies. We have all these different terms of trying to connect to this emotional feeling. If two guys have a relationship as a friend relationship, what's it called? A bromance. We have to figure out a name to put to that. Or we say we've got all the feels for something. That could be ice cream, that could be babies, that could be your spouse. It's just hard for us to really capture the idea of love. And I think sometimes this can skew the way we see the term used for God's love. Our culture, just like Drew said earlier, wants to suggest that love is only some type of feeling. It's an emotional posture. And to feel good about somebody else, and if I don't feel good about somebody else, about the actions of somebody else, I'm considered what? Not loving. If I don't feel the same way that somebody else does about how they're living or the decisions they're making, you just don't love me. If I don't show tacit approval of what you're doing, of anyone and anything, I'm not loving. I'm just a hateful person. But we see that Scripture does not describe this idea of love as just a feeling. What does the Bible say about love? Let's look at that real quick. The Bible has 4 different terms to describe love, which makes it much more easier for us to distinguish between love. One of the 4 is agape, and that term describes the love of God. And it's used over 259 times in the New Testament. And it's describing an act of the will. So more than just a feeling. Here's a definition of it. An intelligent, purposeful attitude of esteem and devotion, a selfless, purposeful, outgoing attitude that desires to do good to the one loved. So agape love does not merely feel, it's not just an emotion, but it acts. And we see that throughout Scripture. Let's look at John 3:16. We can probably all quote this. John 3:16. It says, "For God so loved," or agaped, "the world, He gave His only Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have eternal life." Notice how God's agape, or His love, is directly linked to God's giving. Not just in an emotional response. Not just this idea of meeting somebody's emotional need, but it's to a conscious choice and decision to do something. Okay? Romans 5, verse 8 spells this out perfectly. But God shows His agape for us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Do you see that it's an act of the will? It doesn't just say God had all the feels for us. This kind of love is far, far greater than emotion. Because romantic love, brotherly love, even family love has limitations. It has limits to it. The first thing that one of the limits of earthly love, we'll just kind of put all those loves as earthly love, it's based on a need. We see that romantic love needs intimacy. Friends need companionship. Family members need support. But agape love is offered free of need, extended by a person whose greatest need has already been met in Christ. And it's originating in a God who has no needs. Let me ask you this question. Let me say this. The greater the need love is asked to meet, we are more cautious to give it. Let me say that again. The greater the need love is asked to meet, we are more cautious to give it. Why is that the case?
It takes more effort.
It takes more effort? What do you mean by that?
It takes more effort on our part to give it.
Yeah.
There's more action involved.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
It carries responsibility.
It carries a huge responsibility. Yeah. What else?
Usually requires you to be more vulnerable.
Yeah. The stakes of rejection are high. I mean, you are really going out on a limb when you're giving that kind of love. But because agape love is not bound by a need, it's given without any kind of fear. We fear rejection, but agape love does not. It also desires reciprocity. We offer earthly love. When we offer that, we expect that it will be returned. If no return, then typically this type of love kind of withers away. Agape love is given without any kind of requirement for return. It's extended without an expectation of a return. In many cases, agape love, if you look at the ledger, it's very imbalanced. Agape love is this willingness for no return. But it also, the ideas or the limitations of earthly love is it worth it? That's maybe something that we ask ourselves when we're dating somebody or we're kind of taking the next steps with somebody. Is it worth it? It weighs the worth of its object. We choose whom to love based on some measure of worthiness. And we direct our love to people who we may agree with, who are powerful, who are intelligent, who have common interests with us. But agape fixes itself on those in the world without regard as any kind of worthiness. It fixes itself on the world, on people that the world would regard as unworthy. And here we see this idea of agape love having no limits, like we've just described with earthly love. In 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 8, it really describes its scope. It says, love, or agape, is patient and kind. Agape does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Agape bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Agape never ends. That's a pretty black and white statement, right? Agape never ends. It's limitless. Any comments or questions off that? So we understand the position of agape love. Now let's talk about how agape love can be rightly ordered. 1 John 4, verse 19 says, we agape because he first, and I made this word up, agape us. We love because he first loved us. And in the handout, the key text that I mentioned was in Matthew 22, Mark 12. Go ahead and turn there. Mark 12. Mark 12 and verse 29. We see this idea of rightly ordering our love. Because it moves from the vertical to God and then to the horizontal to other people. So Mark 12, in verse 29, it says, Jesus answered the most important, when somebody comes up to him and asks him what the most important law is, he says, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. So unless we love God with every fiber of our being, with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, we will love other people inadequately. So first we love God. Second, we love others. And this order is significant because agape begins with the vertical relationship with God. And then it moves towards this idea or the horizontal relationship with each other or with people within our community. Anybody in our horizontal relationship. So when we understand what God has shown us in his love, loving us when we were unlovable, loving us when there was no return, we can love others around us with that same type of love, rightly perceiving ourselves to be unworthy recipients of this type of agape love of God. We become willing to love our neighbor as ourselves. We begin to love our neighbor in spite of himself because God first loved us in spite of ourselves. We don't wait to feel love. Rather, we will ourselves act in love, whether we feel it or we don't. This agape love transcends all of our feelings. Sometimes when we're having difficult loving our neighbor, we may have situations where it's hard for us to love somebody else. You know, we kind of attempt to try to love them even harder. Like, I'm really going to focus on trying to love this person just a little bit more. I'm really going to try. I'm really going to make it happen. But that typically doesn't work out well. A deficit in our love towards other people always points towards a deficit towards God, that we're not loving God the way that we should, that we're giving him everything of us. And so restoring that vertical is the first step in really righting the horizontal. Does anybody have any comments or questions off that? Yes, ma'am.
Well, we love God, who is lawgiver. We're going to obey his commandments.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are the two greatest, loving your neighbor, and it covers so
Yeah, Matthew 22 describes it that. What does it say in Matthew 22? It says, all the other law, what, depends or hangs on this law itself. Yeah, absolutely.
1 John 5:3.
What's that say?
For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments.
Yeah, that kind of reiterates what he has preached and what he has said in his ministry. Absolutely. Any other comments? Yes, sir.
1 John 2, verses 3 through 5. Now by this we know that we know him, if we keep his commandments. He who says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, truly the love of God is perfected in him. By this we know that we are in him.
Yeah, that's a fantastic passage. It just kind of jumps off the pages, especially in John, his letters. You see that a lot. Yeah, great point. Any other comments? Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Sometimes the people who need love the most are the most difficult to love.
Ooh.
That's good.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And oh, never mind, I won't say that. Great point, Miss Patty.
What was the point, man?
Say it again.
Sometimes the people who need love the most are the most difficult to love.
That's a lot of truth there. All right, let's talk about the search for love. Self-love. It's a common mantra in our world today. Raise your hand if you heard about self-love. All right, it's a good amount of people. I think it's all over our culture, actually. Its footprint is all over social media. You see it in pop culture. You see it kind of getting its tentacles in religion in America. It's on our Insta stories, it's podcasts, blogs, TED Talks, YouTube, you name it. This idea of self-love really inundates us and permeates the culture in America today. I did a couple Google search. Actually, it was a really quick Google search. It wasn't very hard to find these quotes. Here's a quote really jumps off the page. Love yourself so much that when someone treats you wrong, you recognize it. To fall in love with yourself is the first secret to happiness. I don't know any of these people, by the way. I'm quoting. Self-love is the source of all other loves. And I think this one really captures this whole point. Even when it seems that there is no one else, always remember that there's one person who never ceases to love you. Yourself. Oh. Doesn't that make you feel good? I mean, I feel great when I start reading these. Self-affirmations and self-love. Here's what they look like. You are enough. Raise your hand if you've seen that on social media. I'm sure you've seen that on social media. Yeah. You are enough. You're perfect the way you are. Or you're entitled to your dreams. You're the hero of your story. You can't love others until you love yourself. Those are just some affirmations that we see in this self-love movement. And I truly believe that some people have good intentions with this movement. I think we put this inherent worth and value on us. And our value and worth as human beings, sometimes people think of it this way, it's not dependent on externals, like what we look like, our weight, our possessions, our achievements. And if the You Are Enough movement, self-love movement was stopping right there, I could tend to understand that and agree with that. I think that's a great idea. I'm hopeful that we can kind of start seeing that in this class throughout this quarter. The idea that we're made in the image of God and that we have this identity in God. But unfortunately, most people don't just leave it there. That's not all this phrase means. It just means so much more to people. And that's exactly what the devil likes to do with temptations and sins. He puts a whole lot of truth in something, and he baits it out there for us. And there's just a teeny tiny bit of, I guess it's a lie, and it looks very benign from the outside. And when you logically think it through and you understand the implications that come from this type of understanding, it can take you to really dark places. And we're about to go to one of the dark places. Yeah.
All those statements are beautiful.
Yeah.
We put God at the head of it.
Mm-hmm.
God is all of that first.
Yeah.
And then after that, we need to have self-esteem. We need to feel good about ourselves. But we need to feel the best about God because He's never going to let us down. He's never going to be wrong.
Yeah.
And if we put our trust in Him, we put all our eggs in His basket.
Yeah.
Heaven bound.
Yeah. Let's look at this this article. This article was written in September of 2021 in the New York Times, written by Laura Bazelon. It was titled, "Divorce Can Be an Act of Radical Self-Love." All right. Hang on to your seats. She describes how she chose her career over her marriage and over her family, and how this is a good thing, and that she used to think divorce was shameful, traumatic, and bad for the kids. She says, "But I've learned that divorce can also be an act of radical self-love that leaves my whole family better off. My divorce nearly 7 years ago freed me from a relationship that was crushing my spirit." She goes on to say, "There was no emotional or physical abuse in our home. There was no absence of love. I was in love with my husband when we got divorced. Part of me is in love with him still. I suspect that will always be the case. Even now, after everything, when he walks into the room, my stomach drops the same way it does before the roller coaster comes down." How do you think she defines love? In emotion. Okay. "I divorced my husband not because I didn't love him. I divorced him because I loved myself more." At least she's honest. She goes on to explain that she was obsessed with her career. "It gave me an identity, a purpose, a comfort of knowing I could support myself." She traveled constantly and was rarely present for her husband and kids. She said that, "I would retreat to an inner world that made it hard to focus on the people right in front of me." Once again, 2 points for honesty. She fought hard to stay married, scaled back her workload because she had always heard that divorce was terrible. She said, "But deep inside, I knew that trying to force myself to subordinate my ambitions and always put our children first would have been impossible without lopping off a vital part of myself." Once she was finally divorced, it was liberating for her. And she said that she wasn't alone in this feeling, that she interviewed many people that had very similar sentiments. She mentions a recently divorced 38-year-old mother who was so proud that she was able to pick out everything in her apartment. She said, "Everything is my choice, and I'm in charge." Bazelon knows divorce can be miserable for some. This is kind of a big quote, but I think it has a lot of meaning for us. But for unhappily married women who are able to support themselves and their children, breaking free can also be like plunging into a cold ocean, a shock to the system that is at once brutal and cleansing. They can emerge stronger and clearer-eyed. Their children benefit because happier mothers are better parents. I no longer think of divorce as shameful or feel sorry for people who tell me that they have decided to end their marriages. There are many ways a family can be broken. Sometimes the healthiest decision is to remove the cracking shell of the nuclear family before the shards embed themselves in the precious little people nestled inside. My divorce spared my children that pain and let me live the life I was meant to. I view that as an accomplishment. Wow. That is truly a disturbing article on so many levels. And I'll give her credit. I mean, she's brutally honest about herself. But think of where she started. Where did she start with this type of thinking? I divorced him because I loved myself more. I loved myself more. How we view ourselves and how we find our identity is really important. And you can see how someone can pretty much justify anything they want based off of this type of movement, of this self-love movement. They can do whatever they want. I committed adultery and I stole this man's wife because I loved myself more. Or I'm a man and now I identify as a female, even though I have male chromosomes and I have the body parts of a male, because I love myself more. You can see where this type of logic and reasoning goes, and it can be very difficult for us to really get off that train if you continue down that path. I see this idea moving into the Christian worldview. I use that very liberally, where people, if they think they're a Christian, just kind of go with that idea. What does the Bible say about self-love? As we just read, it says that you love your neighbor as yourself. And people that really champion this self-love movement, they raise this verse to conclude, well, there you have it. Jesus is telling me to love myself. And you can't love others until you love yourself. I have to fill up my own love tank first before I can really pour out love to others. What are the problems with that? Are there any problems with that? Yes, ma'am.
It doesn't mirror in any way, shape, or form the love that the Lord displayed for us, which was total selflessness.
Yeah, it has nothing even in the realm, in the solar system of agape love. Not even close to act of a will. Yes, sir.
I think part of the magnitude of this lie is the idea that if I can redefine what words mean, if I can call what once was considered a vice now a virtue,
Yeah.
I've erased the moral conflict.
Yeah.
There's nothing to wrestle with anymore because I just changed what it.
Yeah, Isaiah bemoans that as a prophet, calling good evil and evil good. What is it? Things that are sweet, bitter, bitter, sweet, that type of stuff? Yeah.
And the way God has fixed it, when I lose myself in helping my brother, that takes care of me. That gets me where I want to be.
Yeah.
Versus doing everything for myself. If I'm going out of the way, bending over backwards for somebody that's got to have it, boy, that works on my side in a beautiful way.
Yeah. Remember what we talked about, rightly ordering our love. If we ever feel this way, it's very possible that our vertical love is off kilter. That we probably need to fix that first. Because what does He supply to us? Limitless love. Your tank is never empty if the vertical is correct, right? So this idea really changes the idea of love to self-esteem. And usually when our society talks about loving ourselves, it refers to how we feel about ourselves. But as we've already discussed, agape love is not just a feeling, it's about action, the act of the will, particularly acting in someone's best interest despite personal loss, despite sacrifice, inconvenience, and even discomfort. Think about Luke 10, where the lawyer comes to him and says, "And who is my neighbor?" What kind of parable is following after that? The parable of who? The Good Samaritan. So the Good Samaritan, do we have any indication on how the Good Samaritan felt about himself? No, we don't. What do we know about Samaritans back in those days? In the Jewish mindset? Yeah, they were like less than a human. They were barely even a human in the eyes of a Jew. So I would suspect that he probably didn't have a high, self-worth with the people that he was around. But he felt his own value and worth, but how he felt about his own value and worth had nothing to do with whether or not he demonstrated this to the man that needed his compassion. Do I really need to see myself as awesome to help someone in need? Is maybe a question that you should consider. And then, secondly, Jesus knows we already love ourselves. Let's look at Mark 12 like we were just looking at again. Notice that it's not a command to love ourselves. It's a command to love others as we love ourselves. The love of ourselves in that command is an assumption. Jesus assumes we all love ourselves. And on the basis of this assumption, He can make our self-love the measure of how we treat other people. Everybody looks out for his own best interests. In other words, our self-love that Jesus assumes in this commandment is our desire for happiness and our desire to minimize our unhappiness. And as you see in this text, the words are not a command to love yourself. Rather, they're an assumption to love your neighbor as you have already loved yourself. Turn to Ephesians 5. Paul will utilize this idea of loving your neighbor as you love yourself to how a husband loves his wife. Look in Ephesians 5 and verse 28. It says, "In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body." Everybody loves himself. So in this text, loving yourself means nourishing and cherishing. It doesn't mean esteeming or just a feeling. It means to take care of. So no one ever hates himself in the sense that everybody wants to be happy. Everybody pursues happiness. All people love themselves in this sense. And we should make that the measure of how we love others. We see this 100 times in every day. I love myself, so I feed myself. I love myself, so I give myself rest. I love myself, so I don't run into the middle of an interstate and get hit by a truck. I love myself. And so when Jesus commands us to love our neighbors as we love ourselves, He's saying that we should make the measure of our own desires for happiness or our own desire to minimize our misery the measure of our desire for other people's happiness. Let me say that again. We should make the measure of our own desire for happiness or our own desire to minimize our misery the measure of our desire for other people's happiness. And what this looks like is we should want their happiness the way we want our happiness. We should want their good and their success the way that we want our good and our success. We should want them to avoid harm and suffering the way that we would like to avoid harm and suffering. And even people who claim to hate themselves or to abuse themselves with drugs or alcohol are acting in what they believe is in their best interests. They believe that how they're helping themselves, they're loving themselves, is through drugs, alcohol, whatever it may be. They're trying to relieve themselves from pain. So even in that scenario, they're showing that they love themselves. This is truly a radical teaching of Jesus. This is what Jesus means when he calls us to love our neighbor. And Paul reiterates this idea in Philippians 2 when he looks to the model example of how we're to live out agape love. He looks at Jesus and he says in Philippians 2 and verse 3, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you not only look to his own interests, but to the interests of others." And he says declaratively at the very end, a direct command, if we would like to put it that way, "Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus." He calls us to this life of humility, of looking out for the interests of others more than ours. That is agape love. Denying ourselves and to put others above ourselves is the key to fulfilling the greatest command. And Jesus says in Matthew 16, verse 34, he says, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Jesus never asked us to do anything that he was not unwilling to do himself. He picked up that cross. He denied himself. And the sins of the world were rested on those shoulders. That's the type of love that we see in him. That agape love that is an act of the will. Yeah, Courtney. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There's going to be a point when you're loving yourself, Courtney said, and it's just not going to be enough. You're just not going to have enough there. And it's kind of a fool's errand to keep up with loving yourself. Because you're going to read the next blog, you're going to read the next book, you're going to do the next thing to make yourself better. Somebody have their hand up over here? Carrie, sorry.
I was going to say something exactly like that.
Oh.
So same thought. Like we cannot love ourselves enough.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fool's errand. Yes, sir.
You mentioned social media earlier. I think one good example we have now are there are people on social media that make a living out of going out and filming themselves, helping homeless people,
Yeah.
giving them food,
Yeah.
shelter. And while their actions are great, why do they have to film it?
Yeah.
To me, that's one of the biggest forms of narcissism.
Yeah. You know, and the self-love movement, we're seeing a lot of narcissists come out of this movement because it's all about me. It's all about me. Yes, ma'am. You were about to say something.
I was gonna say, I think there's like a distinction between the world's idea of self-love and like what our idea of like self-stewardship should be, in the sense of like not loving yourself just for the sake of yourself, but the idea of like nurturing your body in the sense that this is like a gift from God, the same way like my money or something.
Yeah.
That like we can steward it, but in a way that's
Yeah.
like loving to ourselves, but it's ultimately out of love for God.
Great point. 1 Corinthians 6 describes this idea, for you were bought with a price, right? So glorify God in your bodies. I think that same idea is what you just mentioned. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, it turns in, self-love absolutely turns into idolatry. You are the idol. You know, I love me some me. It feels great to talk about myself. Yeah.
1 John 4:17 following. Herein is our love made perfect, that we may have boldness in the day of judgment, because as he is, so we are in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casteth out fear, because fear hath torment. He that feareth is not made perfect. We love him because he first loved us. If we say we love God and hate our brother, if a man
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty black and white, especially in the letters of John. All right, we saw a bad version of love. Let's look at the correct version of love. What does agape love look like in action? I think love like this confronts sin. You see that in Galatians 6, verse 1. It says, brothers, if anyone is caught in any transgression, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness. Keep watch on yourself, lest you too be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. In that context, the law of Christ is loving others as you love yourself. The greatest burden that we can bear for other people is their sins. And confronting sin is that way in which we can do that. Thank you so much. Appreciate your comments.